This is Phoenix Spencer Horn. She was 21, bright, kind, and deservedly well loved. Meanwhile, this is Euan Methevin. He was 27, quiet, intense, and harbored a darkness that no one saw coming. In a quiet Scottish town just outside of Glasgow, this young couple lived together in a small flat that appeared ordinary to anyone passing by. They appeared happy on social media, and many of their videos showed them laughing, sharing meals, and building a future together. However, behind closed doors, something far more sinister was brewing, and what began as a loving relationship gradually became controlling, suffocating, and eventually dangerous. Both ever-loving and forgiving, Phoenix Spencer Horn was hopeful that her boyfriend would change in time, but the truth is, she actually underestimated how dangerous and broken he really was. I mean, you can't really blame her, in all honesty. Euan may have been a little strange and awkward, sure, but nobody would have assumed that he would be capable of murdering someone, let alone his own partner. And then, on a cold night in November of 2024, he did something that was truly unthinkable. But what really sets this case apart from the rest is what Euan did to her body and himself in the hours after her murder. And, well, let's just say for now, it will leave you utterly horrified. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're looking at the gruesome case of Phoenix Spencer Horn, and the man who is responsible for all of it. So, please grab yourself a coffee, hit subscribe for more dark stories like this every single week, and let's begin. This is the case of Phoenix Spencer Horn. Good morning, folks. Today, we're heading to the north of the UK and to the beautiful country of Scotland. Now, although we don't visit Scotland too often on this channel, it's a place that is rich in history and atmosphere. From the rugged peaks of the Highlands to the crumbling castles that are scattered across the coastline, it's a country that is shaped by centuries of rebellion, poetry, and pride. Today, we're focusing on a quieter corner of the country, that being the town of East Kilbride. And although this town sits only 10 miles south of Greater Glasgow city centre, it very much stands on its own. East Kilbride was Scotland's first official new town, developed back in the year 1947 to ease Glasgow's post-war overcrowding. It was built as a carefully planned community, promising leafy suburbs, roundabouts, and neatly laid shopping centres. A model of modern living, designed for a better and brighter future, as they said. For many, that vision still holds true, and East Kilbride remains a family-oriented place, which is home to over 75,000 people. But like many towns born from idealism, it also has its own shadows. And did you know that, on a separate note to this story, it was in the year 2005 when East Kilbride was thrust into the national spotlight when police discovered the body of Vicky Hamilton, who was buried in a back garden. Her killer was actually Peter Tobin, a man who was later unmasked as one of the UK's most prolific serial murderers. On that note, let me know if you'd like to hear more about this kind of traditional true crime story. Vicky Hamilton's case shook the town's sense of safety, and in the decades that followed, East Kilbride saw a slow but steady rise in domestic and drug-related violence. Changes that reflect a broader shift across the country's post-industrial towns. And moving forward, it is here, on a quiet residential street named Glenlee, that 21-year-old Phoenix Spencer Horn lived with her 27-year-old partner Euan Methevin. Born in 2003, Phoenix was the youngest of 4 children. Her family lived in the small Scottish town of Strathaven, which can be found in South Lanarkshire. The family was close-knit, loving, and grounded, and her parents provided the kind of home where their children all flourished. Speaking of her parents, Alison and Graham raised their children with strong values, and Phoenix appeared to take all of them to heart. Because even as a child, she stood out. And it wasn't just her that turned heads, but her spirit too. She was bright, warm, and full of quiet compassion. The kind of person who noticed when someone was struggling, and instinctively would always step in to help. While studying at Strathaven Academy, she became known for the same traits that shaped her at home. She was kind, humorous, and had an incredible sense of empathy. And her teachers remembered her as not only someone who worked hard, but someone who made others feel seen. After finishing school, Phoenix threw herself into work and the adult world, working at the local Strathaven hotel, serving the good stuff at a cafe. And of course, I'm talking about coffee. And apparently, she made it look completely effortless. Both colleagues and managers alike respected her. And as for her customers, well, let's just say they adored her. Outside of work, Phoenix's life was both sweet but simple. She basically prioritized her family, loved music and long walks in the countryside, and posted many videos to TikTok. Basically what everyone in their 20s does nowadays. As you can see, her TikTok account was filled with many happy moments. Ice cream with friends, golden hour selfies, and goofy snaps with her siblings. And it was during this period, while balancing her jobs, enjoying her freedom, and beginning to shape her future, that she would eventually and unfortunately meet a man named Euan Methven. Now, at first, he did come across as gentle and reserved, the kind of man who didn't say much in crowds, but showed a softer, more thoughtful side when behind closed doors. And I think you Americans and Aussies would probably just call that a typical British man, but even to our standards, he was reserved. At the time that this story takes place, Euan Methven was 27 years old. Growing up in Straven, which is only a few miles away from East Kilbride, he lived there with his family and attended local schools. And moving into his adulthood, he would work as a postman for Royal Mail, a quiet, dependable job, and by many accounts, one that he apparently did well in. To those who knew him casually, Euan came across as sociable and popular, yet a little bit shy. However, there was another side to him too. One that many people rarely saw in him. Several neighbors recalled flashes of anger beneath that charm, and a certain deadness in his stare when his expression slipped. And for those who had once scrolled through his social media, the signs were even harder to ignore, because from the age of 14 through to around 18, he posted a string of troubling messages online where his tone was violent, angry, and deeply misogynistic. In one post he wrote, "You've always got that one person you choke to smash fuck out of." Another one read, "It's kill or be killed." And in one of the more disturbing messages, he described wanting to, quote, "kick her big horrible fucking teeth out," which of course is a northerner's way of saying a punch up. Now, there wasn't only just one or two, but dozens of messages like this. To make matters even more cringe, Euan described himself as a local drug dealer and occasional porn star, and he would even boast about how anger made him feel tingly and agitated. Now, although the posts were eventually deleted and scrubbed from the internet, they were not forgotten by all of those who had already seen them. Euan's online facade revealed a teen who appeared to be consumed by violence and ego, and whether or not it was merely just a phase, nobody could ignore the warning signs. But fast forward a few years, and now Euan was quietly working at Royal Mail. Colleagues claim that he always kept to himself, did his rounds without complaints, and tried not to draw much attention. Which is quite the plot twist really, from local drug dealer and occasional porn star, to part-time postie and full-time walking red flag. Anyway, it was sometime in late 2022 when he eventually met Phoenix. They apparently crossed paths at a family gathering when she was only 20 years old and he had just turned 25. At first glance, they seemed like total opposites. Phoenix was full of light and laughter, and Euan, well, Euan was Euan. But sometimes it's actually that contrast that will eventually bring people together. Friends described her as gentle, funny, and fiercely loyal, and apparently she was the kind of person who just always knew if he needed a hug or some kind of support. Now, on the surface, their circumstances did seem like a good match. I mean, she was studying while working part-time, and he had a steady job. So it was quite the balanced pairing. From what I could tell, Phoenix was a very good partner and basically brought energy and color into his life and made him try new things. Basically, she brought him out of his shell. And as for Euan, well, at least in the beginning, he seemed like a charming man. And as things moved along, he made a very good impression to her family. Her friends would even describe him as attentive, loving, and even doting. And of course, from everything that Phoenix shared, it really did seem like she loved him to the moon and back. So, as it always goes, fast forward a few months and the two are now living together in a small rented flat in East Kilbride, and at least from the outside, everything appeared to be dandy. They celebrated birthdays, took photos together, and even popped around to see the family basically every week. Just another couple figuring life out. However, behind the scenes, things were not quite so straightforward. You see, over time, Euan slowly started to change. It didn't happen all at once, but basically crept in slowly. And it was little things at first too. like offhand criticisms, moodiness, and basically just sulking when things didn't go his way. And then came the jealousy, not only over her friends and who she spoke to, but even over her job and the way that she dressed. Being the empathic person that she was, Phoenix desperately tried to calm him, but the truth is that those cracks simply kept on widening. His insecurities deepened, and over time, Euan became volatile. Now, Phoenix never made a big scene. Instead, she started opening up to friends about it, quietly letting them know that things were no longer working. And by mid-2024, she had finally made her mind up. She wanted space from Euan and was ready to move on. But Euan would not take that rejection very well, and apparently had the perfect excuse for her. He claimed that he wasn't actually a bad guy. Instead, he was just a poor victim to cocaine, steroids, and alcohol, and that once he had his addictions under control, everything would change, eventually. But rather than seek real change, he would use these vices as excuses. And ever patient as always, Phoenix believed him. By November of 2024, Euan and Phoenix had lived together for nearly 2 years. And unfortunately, Euan was still slipping deeper into substance abuse, emotional volatility, and a need for control. When looking at what was going on in the background, it all kind of made sense. Because not only did Euan feel stagnant and stuck in his mundane job, but he was still caught in cycles of dependency. Safe to say that Phoenix never should have put up with this, but tragically, it was her very own compassion and kindness that would not only keep her there, but also lead her straight into betrayal. The date was November the 16th, 2024, and was a Saturday night like any other. Phoenix had finished her shift at the Straven Hotel before then returning home to her boyfriend. Meanwhile, Euan had spent the entire afternoon alone and had even messaged her to say that he was apparently feeling lonely. Phoenix replied with warmth, promising that they'd be together soon, and later that evening, the two shared a takeaway in front of the TV. From the outside, it looked like a normal, quiet night in, just two people in a long-term relationship sharing dinner and winding down together after a long week of work. At 9:37 p.m, Phoenix messaged her mother to say that the two were having dinner at home. Not only was the message short and casual, but it hinted that nothing was wrong. However, sadly, only a few hours later, everything would change. It was just after midnight that neighbors heard loud noises and hurried footsteps, which seemed to echo from above them, an odd energy that seemed out of place from a normal weekend evening. But just as quickly as those strange noises began, silence suddenly followed. And I'm talking about silence not only from the apartment, but also from Phoenix's phone, because as the night continued, she wouldn't respond to any phone calls or text messages. The rest of the night passed undisturbed, and the flat stayed dark, and her phone stayed silent. It was only the following morning, when Phoenix still hadn't replied to her mother, that Allison started to grow cautious. She messaged her daughter to ask if she was okay, and although she did eventually receive a message back, it was short and out of character, simply saying, "Sorry, I've just woken up." Euan himself had also exchanged messages with Allison, claiming that the both of them were simply drunk that night and that her daughter was still asleep, which once again felt concerning because this was a little out of character for her. Her family were concerned, yes, but they figured that maybe she might just need some time to nurse her hangover, and so the rest of the day slid by without much more investigation. However, when she failed to turn up for her shift at work the following day, on Monday the 18th of November, that is when her family became really worried. No surprise, they contacted the authorities to investigate. At 12:10 p.m, just after noon, officers arrived at the flat, and although they were mostly interested in finding Phoenix, it was Euan who answered, who appeared to be calm, collected, and eerily quiet as usual. He invited the officers in, and once they stepped inside, what they found was nothing short of horrific. The smell of copper filled the hallway, and police officers immediately spotted a naked body lying in the room, a body which had been partially covered by a tea towel. They could instantly tell that Phoenix had suffered extreme mutilation, and not only had her head been severed, but it had also been placed upright beneath her left arm next to her torso. Taking a look around the property, it appeared that Euan had tried to dismember her. 2 bloodied knives were found near her body, with a third that was also stained discovered in the bedroom. Officers noted that the scene was so brutal, intimate, and unflinchingly violent, and, even stranger, throughout it all, Euan remained composed. Surprisingly, Euan answered all of their questions with full transparency and without any resistance whatsoever, and when they asked him why he did such a thing, he bluntly said that he couldn't stay in the flat with a full body, which is why he tried to dismember her. This chilling flatness, which was spoken without any panic or remorse, left all detectives truly horrified. And the worst part is that Euan really did not seem to care. I mean, at one point, he even turned to an officer and said, "I guess this is what my next 25 years look like." And so, no surprise, our postman was swiftly arrested and then delivered straight to a jail cell. Express delivery included. The next stage was quite simple. Forensic investigators sealed the scene and then began documenting every inch of the apartment. They looked at her body placement, the knife positions, and all stages of decomposition. And tragically, it turns out that Phoenix had been stabbed more than 20 times, with many of those being straight to the face. And the report would also conclude that, despite many of these stab wounds being to the face, it was a single stab to the chest which likely killed her. Even after his arrest, Euan could not stop yapping. He told the officers that he had blacked out during a drug-fueled episode, and suggested that maybe steroids, cocaine, and alcohol all played a role into his behavior. At no point did he try to deny responsibility. Instead, he seemed fixated on painting himself as a broken man who was fractured by substance abuse and deep-seated emotions. And as it turns out, this wasn't actually the first time he had confessed to murdering Phoenix, because only a few moments before police came knocking at the front door, he had dialed 999 himself. On the call, he had calmly told the operator that he had murdered his girlfriend, and when asked by the operator if he was sure that she was dead, he responded with, "I know she is dead, mate. She is dead. I even tried to dismember her." So, what really happened that fateful night? Well, according to him and the forensic evidence available, it was shortly after midnight and without warning that Euan suddenly launched himself on Phoenix. Apparently, there was no cause or commotion to any of this. He just merely wanted to kill her, and after jumping on top of her, she was strangled before then being stabbed more than 20 times. At 12:13 AM, a neighbor who was downstairs reported hearing a loud bang, with a series of footsteps overhead then following. By then, it was already too late. Phoenix was gone. But what followed next was almost unbelievable. Now alone in the flat, Euan placed her body in the bathtub, retrieved 3 knives from the kitchen, and then, in unimaginable horror, removed her head. By morning, the place that they had once called home was no longer recognizable, and the silence that followed was only interrupted by the sound of Euan pacing the apartment. There were no cries for help, no calls to emergency services, and no screams of regret. This was now merely a flat that was soaked in horror, and a killer who was left alone with what he had done. When her family eventually grew concerned, Euan pretended to be her, texting her mother as if nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, only a few meters away, her lifeless body lay helplessly on the floor. And over the course of that Sunday, Euan's behavior became even more disturbing. Which is kind of crazy to say because you would think it would stop at murder, but seriously, it became far worse, because between 8 AM and 7 PM, he used her phone to watch adult content. And I'm not talking just once or twice here, but literally more than 170 times. Over the next 10 hours, he watched hundreds of these videos, all while his girlfriend's body lay on the floor next to him. You know, I genuinely don't think that you can be more disgusting. That kind of crossover at that level of intensity is just absolutely haunting. In fact, later that day and halfway through this marathon, he would even order drugs to his flat, before then continuing this binge. Surveillance cameras around town would later record him behind the wheel of Phoenix's red Vauxhall Corsa. It was noted that he left the apartment at least once, which was most likely to find a local drug dealer and also seek ways to dispose of the evidence. Either way, it was clear that he was making calculated decisions to rid himself of her death, all while trying to binge himself on another high. Meanwhile, concern was rapidly growing within the family, and when Phoenix didn't show up for work the day after, colleagues from Straven Hotel reached out to her parents, and it was in that moment that they finally had enough. Already suspicious of the situation, Allison phoned the police, and this phone call, paired with Euan's own call to the police to confess, would mark the end of this terrible mystery. It was clear that, up until that moment, Euan had done everything in his power to delay his capture, from forging text messages to watching hours of pornography, right the way through to crude attempts in making it easier to move her body. And it was only when he realized that he could no longer evade the inevitable that he finally dialed 999. Euan's arrest marked the beginning of a complex and deeply disturbing investigation, and although he had confessed at the crime scene and also during his phone call to the police, detectives still had to piece together everything that had happened. Forensic teams spent hours in that flat gathering evidence, and Phoenix's family were informed that, tragically, her body had been found. And, well, let's just say that they haven't been the same ever since. Only 2 days later, Euan appeared in court for the first time, where he was charged with murder and attempting to defeat the ends of justice. He made no plea and no apology and was remanded in custody, and due to the brutality of this case, it was quickly moved to the High Court in Glasgow. Prosecutors built their case in the months that followed, gathering evidence from autopsy reports, digital forensics, witness testimonies, and detailed crime scene analysis reports. Fast forward half a year, and on June 17th, 2025, he was finally ready to stand trial. The room was filled with reporters, onlookers, and grieving family members. Meanwhile, Euan himself stood motionless in the dock as prosecutors laid out the charges in graphic detail. They told the court that Phoenix had been strangled, stabbed repeatedly, and then decapitated. It was also detailed that he watched porn over 170 times and blasted his way through drugs and alcohol while her dead and naked body lay merely meters away from him. With so much against him, Euan knew that there was no chance of him walking away, and so with that in mind, he pleaded guilty to both charges. But that would be only after the prosecution managed to fight their corner, and they said that his actions had been driven by jealousy, possessiveness, and long-term substance abuse. However, the main thing that stood out here was how calculated he had been after the fact. They would claim that this wasn't some sort of freak madness or accident, but instead a series of cold and chilling decisions. And interestingly enough, his defense team wouldn't try to dispute the facts either. Instead, Euan's lawyer claimed that his client had suffered an emotional and psychological breakdown, and that is why he had no memory of the murder. Now, this is the bit that really gets me, but apparently his very own lawyer would say that almost everyone would see him as, quote, the personification of evil. And when your own defense lawyer sees you in that way, well, let's just say you basically know you're pretty much stuffed. Even still, the court was not swayed by claims of a blackout. The evidence told a different story, and as the final arguments were laid bare, the courtroom sat in suffocating stillness. The judge had heard it all, the brutality, the aftermath, and all of the lies. And with Euan's guilty pleas accepted, all that remained was his final sentencing. And on July 14th, 2025, that day finally came. The judge described the killing as truly dreadful and condemned Euan for betraying the trust of someone who had considered him as family. For his crimes, Euan was handed a life sentence with a minimum of 23 years before even being considered for parole. The judge noted that, after the murder, he did not call for help or contact the authorities. Instead, he stayed in the flat for almost 48 hours, indulging on his many vices. This of course revealed a horrific lack of remorse or urgency, and in his sentencing remarks, the judge simply said, "You robbed her of all dignity." The court also heard from Phoenix's family. They read out victim impact statements and voice recordings, which described the pain, heartbreak, and fury left behind, and the silence that now seems to swallow all of their lives. Phoenix Spencer Horn was only 21 years old when her life was taken from her, that being in one of the most horrific ways imaginable. She was young, full of promise and held many dreams. After her death, tributes poured in both online and in person, and a memorial bench now stands in her hometown of Straven, where donations are raised in her name for Glasgow Women's Aid. Her family and friends remember her laugh, her loyalty, and her warmth, and perhaps the hardest question that they still face is, how could someone so kind and so full of life find themselves living under the same roof as someone so dangerous? And how could these TikTok videos be so different from reality? I think another thing to mention here, and I know I often say it on this channel, but what we see online is not always what's real. In fact, so many people out there tend to show their best 1% online, making it seem like it's just another day in their life. But psychologically speaking, it's actually a trap, and it makes everyone else feel like that they haven't got enough. On social media, Phoenix and Euan looked like any other young couple, smiling in photos, sharing trips, and posting the small happy moments of daily life. From the outside, their relationship seemed ordinary, but as we eventually found out, those filtered snapshots barely even told part of the story. Behind the scenes, Euan was struggling with jealousy, insecurity, and a desperate need for control. And Phoenix, well, she was kind and tried to carry that burden quietly. And I suppose that's one of the many dangers of curating your life on social media, because then all of the lies, jealousy, and hatred are all hidden right behind those few pixels. Phoenix's story is a devastating reminder that serious issues can always be hiding in plain sight, and that even the people who seem to be the happiest can actually be suffering behind closed doors. And once again, it brings me back to that very uncomfortable truth about social media, how even those carefully curated images can actually be covering up real danger. Anyway folks, I'm going to wrap up this episode here. However, before you go, I'd love to hear what you think about this one, so as always, please share your thoughts below. And if you haven't already, please do consider hitting that subscribe button, because honestly, it really does help the channel more than you know. And on that note, I'm done for the day, so I'm gonna go have dinner, probably relax for the rest of the evening, and hope that you do too. I'll be back again very soon for another video. But until that moment arrives, please remember to look after yourselves, and of course, stay curious. And I'll see you in the next one. Thank you folks. Goodbye.